In all ages, people have attributed a special sanctity to certain localities, usually those devoted to the purposes of worship. And this sentiment has in many lands been utilized in the interests of mercy by exempting those within the precincts from arrest for some or even all crimes and offences. In the earlier stages of development, the punishment of crime was not regarded as a duty of the community, but as an obligation or privilege of the injured or of those nearest in blood or social relationship. Thus, the son of a murdered man had the right to murder the murderer. The general principle of the earlier forms of justice is the lex talionis, but the infliction of the penalty was mostly in the discretion of the avenger. He might be afraid to attempt to slay a strong or powerful murderer and be willing to pardon the offence for a money consideration. A criminal who took refuge in a sacred place secured at least a breathing time in which his friends might effect a compromise with his adversary. Amongst our Anglo-Saxon ancestors, the church exerted a moderating influence. Every consecrated church had the right to shelter the fugitive from justice for 7 days, and when the building was needed, he might be placed in a house provided for that purpose by the church, which was not to have more doors than the church itself. If the criminal was dragged forth from his refuge, the violators of the sanctuary were fined in varying degrees according to the rank of the ecclesiastical edifice. In 1486, Pope Innocent VIII issued a bull relating to English sanctuaries, by which it was provided that when the refugee left his asylum, he lost his right of protection, even though he subsequently returned to the sanctuary. At the same time, the king was empowered to appoint keepers to look after those who, having been accused of treason, had taken sanctuary. Great changes were made in the law during the reign of Henry VIII. Traitors were wholly exempted from the privilege. Those abjuring the realm were not actually banished, but were to remain throughout life in the sanctuary, and if they left it and committed any offence, they might then be brought to trial. All inmates were to wear a badge 20 inches in length and breadth, were forbidden the use of weapons, and were not to leave their lodgings between sunrise and sunset. In 1538, the right of sanctuary was further restricted, and Wells, Manchester, Northampton, York, Derby and Launceston were declared sanctuaries. Manchester found this privilege to be of such doubtful value that 2 years later it was transferred to Chester and afterwards to Stafford. We have an instructive picture of the working of the sanctuary system in the case of Manchester. An act of Henry abolished the right of refuge in all places except, and the exception is a considerable one, churches, hospitals and churchyards. Perhaps a more important exception was that sanctuary was to be denied to those guilty of murder, rape, highway robbery, burglary, house burning or sacrilege. Whilst abolishing many sanctuaries, certain additional places were named as cities of refuge for minor offenders. One of these was Manchester. A year later, the town petitioned to be relieved from this distinction. The inhabitants set forth that Manchester had a great trade in the bleaching of linen yarn and in the making of linen and woolen cloths and dressing of cotton, and that the influx of dissolute persons to the sanctuary had caused serious damage to the prospects of the town, which, having no mayor, sheriff or bailiff and no jail, was badly circumstanced for dealing with these lawless invaders. The request was granted, and the sanctuary removed from Manchester to Stafford. The system was one that led to gross abuse. It was held that the right did not extend to others than those whose offences entailed forfeiture of life and limb, but in practice knavish debtors, fraudulent executors, etc., availed themselves of the protection. Between 1478 and 1539 at Durham, 283 persons took refuge who were, as principals or accessories, accused of homicide. There were 16 debtors, 4 horse stealers, 9 cattle stealers, and 4 housebreakers. 1 had been charged with rape and 7 with theft. Sir John Holland, in revenge for the death of his esquire, killed the son and heir of Hugh, 2nd Earl of Stafford, and then took sanctuary at Beverley. The murderer in this case was the half-brother of Richard II, but it was with great difficulty that the king was induced to grant a pardon. The Church of St. John of Beverley had a charter from Athelstan, and near the altar was the fridstool, or chair of peace, to which what criminal soever flies hath full protection. The privilege extended for a radius of about a mile round the minster, and the limits were marked by stone crosses. Infraction of the right of sanctuary was punishable by severe penalties, and to take a refugee from the fridstool was to incur both secular and ecclesiastical penalties, the latter extending to excommunication. The widow of Edward IV fled with her younger children for safety to the sanctuary of Westminster after her eldest son had fallen into the keeping of the Duke of Gloucester. Sir Thomas More reports the discussion in the Council of the Protector and the arguments used by Cardinal Bourchier, which induced the Queen to give up the Duke of York. The boy king, who was never crowned, and his brother were murdered in the Tower. It is noteworthy that this unfortunate monarch was born in the sanctuary of Westminster when his father was in exile. The privileges of the sanctuary were not always respected. When Geoffrey, Archbishop of York, took refuge in St. Martin's Priory, Dover, he was dragged from the altar in his pontifical robes by order of the Bishop of Ely, who was then Chancellor of the Kingdom. But this arbitrary proceeding was not the least of the causes of the downfall of William of Longchamp. When William Longbeard, who had been condemned to death, took sanctuary at St. Mary-le-Bow, Hubert de Burgh ordered the church tower to be set on fire to compel him to come forth. Longbeard abandoned his place of refuge and was dragged to Tyburn and there hanged. But although de Burgh was Archbishop of Canterbury and Justiciary of the Kingdom, and the church was his own peculiar, his violation of sanctuary led to the loss of his great secular dignity. Later, when he had himself to seek refuge, a great debate arose as to his having been forcibly taken from a sanctuary, and he was restored to its protection and escaped to Wales. Sanctuaries probably served a useful purpose in ages when the law was harsh and indiscriminate in its punishment of offenders. The limited protection afforded by the church sanctuaries at least gave an opportunity for the first heat of revengeful feeling to subside, and the greater sanctuaries protected not merely vulgar offenders, but those whom the stormy tide of politics had placed at the mercy of their enemies. As the law became stronger and the course of justice more certain, the need for these refugees ended, and those that continued were public nuisances and mere centers of crime and anarchy.